Hi, everybody. I'm back. This is part 2 of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn series. This is going to cover chapters 8 through 14 of the book. I am recording from my car, as you may be able to, infer given the seatbelt and the fact that cars keep driving by. My son is at martial arts, and I thought I would take this opportunity to cut a video. So enjoy the scenery and learn a couple things. Chapters 8 through 14 I have entitled Trials. If you remember, the 4 things we're covering in this book are the hero's journey, search for identity, search for freedom, and cycle of poverty. And throughout this section, Huck has to go through, if we think of our clock, like I pointed out in the previous video, this is 4 o'clock, this is trials. And trials are a series of small encounters that a hero must go through so that they can gain knowledge and abilities in the new world that they have been thrust into or thrust themselves into, so that they can navigate, they can survive in this world. And there's a number of them that Huck goes throughout this section. I'm just going to point them out real quick. There's the ferry that is searching for him, that has all the people from town on there, the one that's blasting the cannon. There's when Huck discovers that someone else is on the island with him. What else do we have? The rattlesnake that he puts in Jim's sleeping area. And the Packard and Turner section where there's the tip over ferry that they go and search. And then there's also when he goes into town and tries to get information from the lady. So all of these trials, what we have to as an audience is figure out is what is it exactly that Huck has learned or can take with him through each of these trials. So that first one, him dodging the ferry with all the people on board, is that he can't be lazy, and that it enforces that need to stay hidden, right? He talks about in the morning how he just kind of wants to lay there. He doesn't go and have breakfast or anything, and then he has to stay hidden, and he's starving, right? And luckily a piece of bread floats over to him, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Him being the only person on the island when it turns out to be Jim, right? He could run, but instead he decides, you know what, I'm just going to confront this trial and see what happens. It also teaches him that you can never rest. He has to be vigilant at all times, right? Nothing is ever completely, he shouldn't take anything for granted. The rattlesnake incident with Jim, when he puts the rattlesnake in Jim's bunk, he learns that there's real dangers and consequences to his actions in this new world. He can't just go and play these pranks and think that it's gonna be okay. When he talks to the lady in town, he says, I was afeard I had made a mistake coming to her to find out what was going on in the town. So, that being bold and being vigilant that he learned previously with Jim on the island, there are limits to that. You can't just rush into every situation and do whatever you want. And then finally, the Packard and Turner situation teaches him that, you've really got to be careful that there are real consequences, right? Everything turns out, it's not, despite the title being The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, unlike chapter 2 where they are playing gang, there are real consequences for actions, right? And so he's stranded on this ferry, the raft is gone, they have to quickly steal the boat from the other. Yeah, I'm watching that lady too. Have to quickly steal the boat from the murderers in order to get back. So this series of trials where Huck is, she's right next to me now. A series of trials that Huck has to go through, give him the skills that he needs to navigate this new world, right? that, you got to take chances, you got to take risks, but at the same time, you have to calculate them. You have to really think about, okay, how am I going to approach this situation instead of just jumping in and thinking, oh, I'm naturally smart to think through with all of this. Let's talk about let's do poverty because it's not as prevalent in this section. It comes up a few times, mostly in the biggest one has to do with Huck and Jim. So when they finally meet on the island, Jim talks about how basically he's so hungry because all he's been doing is eating these wild strawberries that are on the island. Whereas Huck's like, why is this such a big deal? You should be fine. Well, Huck has resources that Jim does not have. And so thus it establishes a hierarchy. Since Huck has the gun, he is the one who says this is what we're doing. Right? So Jim basically has to be subservient to him at this point, even though throughout all of this, Jim is going to prove himself to be much better capable of navigating this world. He's a supernatural aid, and he should be the one that's kind of leading instead of Huck. But Huck, he is the one, he's got fun. He's the one in power. So that subservient poverty hierarchy right there is interesting. And it comes up again later when they're talking about the rewards for Jim and Huck's dad. And it's interesting that the reward for capturing Jim is higher than the reward for capturing Huck's dad. Even though Huck's dad is wanted for suspicion of murder, right? But there's not a high priority on it because the runaway slave is worth more. So, the lady that Huck goes and almost gets trapped with isn't looking for Pap Finn. They're looking for Jim because that's a lot of money, right? It's only $100 difference, which may not seem huge today, but 1840, that's a significant difference. So capturing the runaway slave has a bigger reward. So when you think in terms of poverty, it's interesting that the higher reward comes back to the thing that has the most monetary value for the person seeking the reward. Freedom and identity. Let's do freedom first. A lot of this is Huck kind of weaving in and out of a sense of security, like we talked about, was the real basis of freedom for him. So when at the opening of chapter 18, he says, I laid there in the grass in the cool shade, thinking about things and feeling rested and rather comfortable and satisfied. He enjoys his freedom. He likes not having to live with the widow or have to live with his pap, right? Of course, he hasn't gone through any trials yet. This is the opening, the opening paragraph of his series of trials. So he doesn't quite understand that he doesn't really have security, which he kind of weaves in and out of throughout, right? When he gets back to the island, he finally figures out that he's not alone on there. He comes across the camp that Jim left, and it instantly causes him fright, right? So freedom again is linked with security. Later on, Jim talks about why he ran, right? His search for freedom has to do with security as well. He doesn't want to be free for the sake of being free. He wants to be free so that he can find his family, right? He wants to buy his wife out of slavery. He wants to buy his children out of slavery and have that security. And it's interesting and ironic that, they keep heading further and further south, which obviously means less freedom for him going throughout. What else do we have? Freedom gets boring for Huck at one point. He says, I wanted to get a stirring up some way. So they're on the island, they're doing fine, they're hanging out, they're having a good time, they're eating good. Nobody's coming there to really bother them, but he's dull. He wants adventure. And so it shows his immaturity. You know, he has this security, and then all of a sudden it's dull, and he doesn't want to be stuck there anymore. Which again is ironic because then he decides to go to the town, see what was going on, and he almost loses his freedom because he can't conceal his identity very well. And we'll talk about that later, more later on. And again, ironically, that almost costs him his freedom. And then when they escape the island from the people who are looking for Jim, there's further irony in that he gives up freedom and he gives up security, the security that was making him bored, so that Jim isn't caught, right? So this is one of the key moments where Huck tethers himself to Jim, and they're linked throughout this novel. With the wrecked steamboat, not listening to Jim, again, when we talked about the trials, not listening to Jim almost cost them both their lives and their freedom. So freedom throughout this section, right? It's still him, and this is going to all link to identity. It's still him trying to figure out, what does freedom really mean for me, right? He's no longer in town, so he's not living with the widow. He's not living with the tap. He's on his own. But then he gets lonely, and then he finds a companion. He finds Jim, and he again feels this great sense of relief and freedom. He has this security, but like when he was living with the widow and like when he was with his dad, that security starts to itch on him, and he then wants to get out of the boredom, the boredom of security, which is an ironic phrase. The boredom of security causes him to further complicate things for himself, and Jim also. The big thing in this section is identity. There's so much about identity throughout all of this that it's important to remember that Huck is a teenage boy. He's a 13-year-old boy. And that, like all teenagers, there is a trying on of different personas in order to begin to develop one's own sense of identity, right? And I'm sure those of you who are teenagers or who were teenagers, you understand this. You go through phases, you try things, right? You go through the emo phase, you go through the jock phase, you go through, the super nerd phase, you go through all these phases that last a couple days to a couple weeks or whatever. And you just got to try them on to kind of see, is this the world where I fit? And okay, there's stuff about it that I like and I'm going to hang on to that. And there's stuff that frankly really kind of stinks and I'm just going to try something else for a while. And throughout all of these chapters, Huck tries on these different identities, these different personas, in order to begin to establish his own identity. The first one in chapter 8 is him talking about prayer. And it's pretty clear that Christianity is not going to be part of Huck's identity, which I'm not going to go into a big discussion of, Christianity, the role of Christianity and the spirituality of Christianity. But he's he's very caring, he's forgiving. He has all of these Christian attributes. He just doesn't buy into the costume, for lack of a better term, of Christianity. There's a section later where Jim says that Tom Sawyer couldn't get up no better plan than what I had. So it's interesting that, throughout all of this, Tom Sawyer is still a basis of comparison for Huck Finn. the section where Jim explains why he ran away, in this funny moment, funny in an ironic sense, Huck says he doesn't want to be labeled an abolitionist, even though that's exactly how he is acting throughout most of the novel. And in the next video, we'll talk more extensively about his struggles with, actual assisting Jim in his journey. But here it shows that struggle that Huck is having. He doesn't want to be an abolitionist, right? Being an abolitionist is, to Huck, one of the worst things you can be. However, at the same time, he doesn't want to be a snitch. He doesn't want to turn in his friend that he now has this freedom and security with. So he's struggling with his identity, right? I tell on Jim, do I turn him in because that is what I morally think I should do? Or do I not betray my friend and be essentially an abolitionist, right? What else do we have? All of chapter 11. So when he goes into town to kind of find out what's going on, it's about his identity. He pretends to be Sarah Williams, right? So he puts on the dress. He tries to put on this persona. And he thinks it's going to be simple. He thinks it's going to be simple to just walk into town and fool anybody, right? Because he can play this part. And he finds out that that's not necessarily true, right? He gets super nervous about things. And the lady eventually, pretty quickly actually, figures out that he's not who he says he is and traps him at certain moments and explains why that happens. An interesting part of identity is after they have stolen the boat, right, and they're escaping from Packard and Turner on the steamboat. Huck says, "I've begun to think how dreadful it was, even for murderers, to be in such a fix," which leads him to go and find the ferryman or the watchman who goes back and presumably runs into Packard and Turner. This part is complicated because Huck is showing more humanity towards these murderers than he does for Jim. Jim keeps telling him this is a bad idea. We shouldn't be doing this. We can't do this. We need to get out of here. We need to separate ourselves. Jim didn't even want to go on that boat, right? He's the supernatural aid, and Huck isn't listening. But then after, instead of saying Jim was right, I need to listen to Jim, Huck complicates things by then wanting to further complicate what they're doing in order to help out these murderers, who definitely would not have helped them if they had caught them on the ferry, right? But again, in that rejection of Christianity, this is a very Christ-like thing to do, right? Christ would forgive these criminals for being criminals, right? Christ would help these men even though, they are sinners. So again, Huck rejects the idea of Christianity, but then acts in a Christian manner. The question is, how are we supposed to feel about Huck at this moment, right? Here's where we've really got to question, is Huck going to be successful on this journey of identity? Or is he just going to end up like his pap? And Huck even says, I may end up being a murderer myself one day, which is one of the reasons he gives for helping the two men. So we've really got to question at this point, where is Huck going to go? We got to think back too to what Jim said, not only about Pap way back in chapter 3 or 4 or whatever, before Pap showed up. There's a big smoke cloud out there. I hope everything's okay. Before, what he says about Pap, how he's torn between these two worlds, and talks about Huck could go down the same path. This is the moment where we could see Huck could go down the wrong path, right? And the right path, if we're being honest, is listening to his supernatural aid, listening to Jim, right? But he doesn't. In the next section, we're going to see more that he doesn't always listen to Jim, and it almost costs them everything. Although it's ironic that a little bit later that Huck says he wants to help the men so that they can be hung when their time comes. So he's developing a sense of justice, even though he's struggling with this idea of, well, I would want somebody to help me if I was, I might be a murderer someday and I would want somebody to help me. He starts to use some of the skills he gains from previous trials also. So when and this is part of developing his identity, when he goes to the Watchman, he uses his previous helpless persona, the Sarah Williams persona, but he tweaks it so that he's not pretending to be a different gender, right? Okay, I can use all of the things I used pretending to be Sarah Williams. I just won't pretend to be a girl at this point because that was the giveaway. That's what almost cost me that time. So he goes to the Watchman and he makes up this story about, his mom and dad and these people being stuck on a ferry, and the Watchman's got to go help him. So he's starting to use those skills in order to succeed at further trials. And it's also part of his development of identity. He drops the female persona of the helpless, 13-year-old, and now just uses the helplessness as a boy so that he doesn't have to put on these extra layers of persona. And the last one I have, is when that last chapter, chapter 14, when it's just him and Jim talking about things. Early in the chapter, he says, well, he was right. He meaning Jim. Well, he was right. He was most always right. And then at the very end of that chapter, he says, I see it weren't no use wasting words. You can't learn an N-word to argue, so I quit. So again, which is it, Huck? Which is it? Are you going to trust supernatural aid? You just said he was almost always right, but then you turn around and you're trying to convince Jim of something that isn't necessarily true, but you don't see the value in him because he doesn't agree with you. So which is it? Jim is not going to always agree with him, right? That's what a supernatural aid is supposed to do. That's what somebody guiding you through a journey is supposed to do, is tell you, no, that's not the right way to do it. Let me show you the right way to do it. And if you constantly reject that, you're not going to be successful in your journey. So at some point, Huck has to accept that Jim knows more about this world than he does. The question will be when, right? And if studying the hero's journey, we're only at 4:00, we've still got a ways to go until we've reached, crisis. And it's not until crisis when maybe, things will start to improve in his identity and his acceptance of people around him as knowing as much or more than he does. All right, so that's part 2. Part 3 will hopefully not be from my car. I will see you all later. Have a great evening.